TopMedTalk.
Well, hello, I'm Desiree Chappell, and this is TopMedTalk. We are here in Orlando, Florida for Anesthesiology 2019, the annual meeting of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. Now, with over 14,000 delegates, this is the largest meeting and gathering of anesthesiologists and anesthesia providers in the world. And as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Editor-in-Chief, Monty Mythen. Hello, Monty.
Hi, Desiree. Great to be here.
It is great to be here. Day three of anesthesia.
Third meeting for us.
It is the third meeting for us.
Of the ASA.
Yeah, it's great. This year we have a booth. We have our very own space. We want to graciously thank our sponsors this year for the booth, because we wouldn't be able to do this and have such a prominent space right here in the middle of the meeting in the exhibit hall. Thank you to Edwards Life Sciences. We could not have done this without you, and spread, free open access medical education to the world. So
yeah, the grants we get from industry partners and from other sources allow us to keep this free and open access. So thank you very much.
Yep, that's how we do it. We also want to say thank you to the ASA for all the support that they've given us this last year, just helping us share the knowledge that we gain through these amazing conversations with the world. So thank you all very, very much. We're also joined today by a frequent voice on TopMedTalk, our friend and my co-pilot on Friday when Monty wasn't able to be here, Mike Grocott. How are you, Mike?
All good.
Yeah, are you surviving?
I'm enjoying the meeting. I particularly enjoyed the Ravenstein this morning.
Oh yeah, tell us about who spoke and what that was about.
So Jerome Adams, if I recall his name correctly, who is the Surgeon General.
Yep.
And as he pointed out, neither a surgeon nor a general, but but an anesthesiologist with so inspiring personal story. But also I thought was a great speaker. Talked a lot about the importance of us focusing more broadly on population health determinants of what goes on. The relatively small contribution, maybe 10% of health care to keeping people healthy and living long, and lots of interesting messaging in that respect. And for me, one of the really interesting things was the very positive response he got from the floor. So he broached the proceduralist physician thing, which can be a bit controversial, and he got a spontaneous round of applause. It's very, very interesting in terms of as a barometer of change of culture here at the ASA.
We know perioperative medicine is something we talk about all the time, and that was kind of some of the things
he's clearly a big fan.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Well, our guest today, actually what I should say is that the guests that we've had over the last couple days, we've had such varied topics. We stuck true to what we talk about a lot as enhanced recovery, goal-directed fluid management. We talked about hemodynamic management. We talked about the POCI, perioperative quality initiatives. We had a great conversation with Lifebox, Monty.
Global Safe Surgery.
Safe Surgery with them. We had a conversation about AI in practice, some really great stuff. And switching gears just a little bit, but kind of staying a little bit more on the technical side, we're going to talk about cerebral oximetry. And we have one of our guests here, Greg Fischer from
Memorial Sloan Kettering.
Greg, thank you so much for sitting down with us on TopMedTalk.
Of course, my pleasure.
Yeah, it's great. I heard you gave a great presentation yesterday, and so I was really hoping that we could kind of get into that a little bit, because we haven't discussed much about cerebral oximetry on TopMedTalk yet. Maybe just a little bit.
So, Greg, Memorial Sloan Kettering is a very famous institution, but we have a broad-reaching global audience.
Thank you, Monty.
Yes. So Memorial Sloan Kettering is one of the major cancer centers in the United States. It's a freestanding cancer center in New York City, and we have ambulatory regional sites around the greater tri-state area.
Great, thank you.
And its mission is to heal cancer.
And exclusively cancer treatments?
It's exclusively cancer treatments and everything that has to do with cancer. That is correct.
Okay, and I guess just first of all, give us a little bit of background beyond that. Like, what have you kind of specialized in? And
well, I've been the chair now at the Anesthesia and Critical Care Department at Memorial Sloan Kettering for 3.5 years. Before that, I was a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist at Mount Sinai Medical Center, which is one of the larger medical centers in Manhattan in New York City. It's about 30 blocks north of where I currently practice. And I ran the cardiac ICU and the cardiac anesthesia services there. And that's how I got involved with cerebral oximetry, pretty much right from the beginning of my career.
And how are you kind of utilizing that in your department now?
Well, that's always been one of the problems that I've seen transitioning away from a cardiac realm into a large, high-risk general type of population. Most of the cases that we do at Memorial Sloan Kettering are very large cancer cases, so they're large abdominal, large thoracic, and there's not really that much literature out there on the utility of cerebral oximetry in these types of cases. Everything, if you read about it, is coming from the cardiac anesthesia field or from the neonatal field. So the neonatologists enjoy using the technology as well. And it just has to do with the very rapid swings and changes in blood pressure, the low flow states that you encounter in cardiac surgery, which you don't encounter as much when you do general type of cases. And that's why you see quicker and more rapid changes in the cerebral oximeter in cardiac cases, and why it's probably found a quicker fan base in that area. And when I moved over to Memorial Sloan Kettering, I started asking myself, well, are there other areas where we might be able to use this technology? And what already started to happen when I was at Mount Sinai was we saw that there might be a way to non-invasively map the cerebral autoregulation curve by using this technology. And that, I think, would change the playing field for cerebral oximetry. If you were able to show practitioners in real time, non-invasively, where their individual patient starts autoregulating cerebral blood flow, I think that would really be a game changer. And clinicians could use that information to tailor hemodynamic management to the individual patient, especially useful in larger surgeries.
I just want to have you break it down, like step it back just a little bit about, cerebral autoregulation and how the technology works, and kind of bringing it all together. Because there's some of our listeners that may be in different spaces that I think would be valuable information to them.
I think first you have to look at cerebral oximetry and how that technology functions. So most of your listeners who come from the realm of anesthesia are going to feel very comfortable with pulse oximetry. It was a technology that's been around for decades, was introduced in the late 80s, early 90s, and within a year or two, I believe, became a standard. So it's amazing how quickly that technology became a standard of care for the practice of anesthesiology. And, today it would be unheard of performing any type of anesthetic without pulse oximetry. And what the technology basically does is it uses the absorption spectrum of hemoglobin to measure the saturation of the hemoglobin molecule with oxygen or not with oxygen. And what we're lucky about is that the hemoglobin molecule can change or changes its three-dimensional configuration, the shape of the molecule, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. And that results in the deoxygenated form and the oxygenated form from having a different spectroscopic fingerprint. It's the same molecule, but it interacts and absorbs light in different wavelengths. So if you know what wavelength you're interested in, which of course we do know, you can use those wavelengths to determine what the concentration is of those chromophores. And when you use pulse oximetry, you only measure it during the pulse. So in other words, you only get the arterial, and that's why pulse oximetry requires not only oximetry but also a pulse. So once you go on the heart-lung machine, or if you have bad peripheral vascular disease, pulse oximetry stops working and it doesn't pick up. Cerebral oximetry uses the same technology, but instead of only using 2 wavelengths, they use 4 to 5 wavelengths, depending on which manufacturer you're using. And that enables them to take out some of the background noise and concentrate just on the hemoglobin, even in a non-pulsatile state. So cerebral oximetry is not measuring the arterial pulse, but it's measuring the tissue, if you want to put it that way. So it's measuring the hemoglobin, the ratio between oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in the cerebral cortex tissue. And that's a little bit of a leap that people have to make when they try and transfer their knowledge that they've acquired in pulse oximetry, which is an arterial saturation, to cerebral tissue oximetry, which is if you want to put it, sort of like a mixed saturation between the arterial and the venous side. And that's something which people have to get accustomed and used to. So the values that you usually see are somewhere between 60 and 80%.
That's what I was going to ask. What values do you use?
So you usually see them between 60 and 80%. And on a pulse oximeter, as you know, we're looking for values usually above 90%, preferably above 94. But and then the other thing which made tissue oximetry difficult in its development, where there were different device manufacturers out there that used different technologies, and some of them were only 2 wavelengths, and they had difficulties filtering out the noise. That's why they weren't used as absolute oximeters, but you had to get a baseline before the patient went off to sleep, and then follow a relative change.
Gotcha.
And so you followed the delta, basically.
Yeah.
And now you're really confusing the average anesthesiologist, right?
It is complicated whenever...
So
relatively when you start using it.
If the background noise, and what I mean with that is other molecules in the brain which can absorb light in the similar wavelength that we're using, gives you background scatter, and we're all a little bit different. What winds up happening is the median might be the same between the two devices, but the standard deviation becomes much larger. So some of these devices were having standard deviations of 10 percentage points, which means 2 standard deviations is 95% of the population. So you could be anywhere between 40 and 90. And, you show, and then you start showing people, and then you started hearing the term, well, this is just a random number generator. What does it mean? And then you'd have to tell, well, if you're using this device, you have to get the baseline before the patient goes off to sleep, and then stay within 20%. And then there were other devices on the market that were technologically more advanced. They were using more wavelengths, and they were able to filter out the background noise, and they were getting standard deviations of only 2 to 3%, which is the same standard deviation that a pulse oximeter has. Right, so they can truly give you a very, accurate absolute value.
Mike, did you?
So, Greg, Monty and I have done work in the past using this kind of technology in a very different context. So, in hypoxia, and we see very credible signals. So, if you expose someone to hypoxia, you exercise them, you see consistent patterns of change, and the inter-individual variability is credible. Mm-hmm. And I've heard you and others speak about this notion of mapping the autoregulation curve. How close are we to having that as something that's going to be clinically useful to the average practitioner?
Well, I'm hoping that it's going to be within a couple of years. I mean, we have a working algorithm right now with one of the companies that I'm working with, and it's Edwards. I think they're sponsoring us, so I'm allowed to say their name. And, things have to be fine-tuned, and you're still going to have to look at it on a large scale with a lot of patients. So the number that we were talking about, just so that I can complete the loop so that people can follow me. So you get now the cerebral tissue saturation. Let's say it's 70%, right? So, and I said it's a tissue saturation value. So what it is, it's a product between your hemoglobin concentration, your cerebral blood flow, and also the PO2. So, like you just said, Mike, if you change or you manipulate any one of those 3 variables, your SCO2 is going to decline. So, when you go on the heart-lung machine, you have the prime that acutely dilutes. You always see a bit of a decline, maybe by 5-7 points in the SCO2. If you become hypoxic, you give patient a hypoxic gas mixture, and the PO2 goes down, your saturation will go down. You also see a decline. And when you come off the heart-lung machine, let's say the heart's not working right, and you're in a low flow state, then the cerebral blood flow goes down, then you also see a decline. Now, the way, or what we're doing now to map cerebral autoregulation is really something quite ingenious. If you believe, and this has been shown, that there is an autoregulatory curve, that between certain blood pressure values, cerebral blood flow remains consistent. What certainly is individual is you don't know where that range starts and where that range ends. The textbooks teach you 50 to 150 map, but I think everybody knows right now that that was made up on a couple of young, healthy medical students where it was probably true when you could pay a lot of money back in the 50s and do these studies on.
Yeah.
When you start looking at our population that we're taking care of now, a lot of patients who are hypertensive, that curve is probably shifted towards the right. So you don't really know where is that safe lower threshold under which the cerebral blood flow becomes a pressure-dependent phenomenon. So, how can we do this? Remember, if I told you it's a product of cerebral blood flow, hemoglobin concentration, and PO2. If you measure the correlation between systemic blood pressure and cerebral blood flow, which you could use the SCO2 to do, because if you have a high temporal resolution, you can pretty much drop the hemoglobin concentration and the PO2 out of that equation. Because if you're measuring at 2 hertz, which means twice a second, even if the surgeon opens the aorta, you're not going to have a change that acutely in hemoglobin. And even if you stop ventilating the patient, the PO2 is not going to go down that quickly. So any change in SCO2 value is going to be a result of a change in cerebral blood flow. So if you make the assumption that cerebral blood flow stays consistent, regardless of systemic perfusion pressure between that range, you can say that even if the blood pressure fluctuates, so if you have, let's say, an 80 map and you go up to 100 map and back down to 90 map, there shouldn't be a change in the SCO2. It should stay consistent. So the correlation between systemic blood pressure and SCO2 should be 0. Now, nothing in medicine is ever 0. There's always a little bit there. So you can make a ratio. You can basically make an autoregulation index, which shows you what the correlation is between those two factors. And we've been using the value of 0.3 to 0.4, somewhere in that range, that if it's less than that, we're saying, there's really no correlation between systemic blood pressure and cerebral blood flow. All right? Which means you're in an autoregulatory zone. You're autoregulating right now. Your cerebral blood flow is consistent. Now, as soon as the blood pressure decreases or increases and you start reaching those 2 inflection points, you're going to see now all of a sudden any change in blood pressure will reflect in a change in SCO2. And that's where you can find the sweet spots, where those inflection points are. So it requires a relatively high resolution, temporary resolution, so about 1 to 2 hertz to be able to really see that. And it does require instantaneous blood pressure measurement and cerebral oximetry. So you can't do it with the cuff, because if you're doing blood pressures every 2 minutes, you're not getting the temporal resolution. So you need some form of instantaneous, continuous blood pressure monitoring. And I'm saying deliberately continuous, not invasive, because there are technologies out there where you can measure the blood pressure non-invasively but continuously without putting in an arterial catheter.
Monty.
So great, fantastic work. Definitely part of the future. I hope we get there soon. I've spent most of my life doing mesenteric research, and so one of the questions we often have, with the brain being sort of on the hierarchy, relatively protected, is the autoregulation point different in different parts of the body, and can we get at that?
That's an excellent question. The problem to get to other parts of the body is that, there was a push in cerebral oximetry to put the probes onto other areas of the body and see what you can measure. Here's a funny thing, and I often tell this jokingly to my friends. The brain is a peripheral organ, right? The beauty of the brain is it's really not that deep, right? So no matter what size you are, what weight you are, the threshold between the frontal and the parietal lobes, your forehead, where we put these sensors, is pretty consistent. Most manufacturers make 3 different probes. There's like a neonate, a child, and an adult-size probe. And whether you're 50 kilos or whether you're 100 kilos, the adult probe is the same. And that's just because the brain is relatively superficial. It's only a couple of centimeters deep. Now, if you look at the way these probes are designed, if you turn them over, you'll see there's 1 emitter and there's 2 receivers. And the penetration depth, in other words, this parabolic flight path that the photons take, that the energy takes, is about half the distance between the emitter and the receiver. So the reason why they have 2 flight paths is one is far apart, and that actually will then go through the scalp, through the bone, into the cerebral cortex, and then back. And the other one is more of a superficial one that will just do the scalp and bone and then land. And if you subtract one from the other, you get the extra cerebral component you subtract out of the cerebral tissue oxygenation. So you're not measuring a diluted byproduct of how well your scalp is being perfused. Now, again, nothing is perfect in medicine. You'll never reach 100%. And that's why some colleagues will come and say, well, when I give phenylephrine, I see the SCO2 go down. That's because what they're really doing is vasoconstricting the skin and the scalp, and then you're seeing a 1 to 2, maybe 3% decline in the number that you see there.
And I'm trying to think through how this will be in practice. Is this?
No one's going to ask that question.
Is it like a passive response, or are you doing a dynamic change in blood pressure?
No, well, it's interesting. So if you look at the Joshi paper, which is the work based on what Chuck Hogue did when he was still at Johns Hopkins, they were doing that. So they were putting patients on the heart-lung machine, and then before they did the actual surgical procedure, they got the perfusionist just to change the level of blood pressure, and then, they measured there, and that's how they were able to find that lower inflection point. That's great if you're doing cardiac, but most people who are coming for, a gastrectomy or something like that are not going to allow themselves to be put on bypass just to find out where the lower inflection point is, right? So you need to have something which is dynamic and works in real time. So the way the setup works is you have input from a continuous blood pressure monitor, whether that's invasive or non-invasive, and you have the cerebral oximeter data which is coming in and being analyzed, and you're constantly looking for the correlation between those two values. So you're looking, are you seeing changes in SCO2 which are correlating with changes in blood pressure? If you're not seeing any correlations, if your index is low, then you're going to they'll map it as a very low ARI, right? And as long as your ARI is very low, you're in a safe zone. So sometimes you'll run a case where you'll never have a patient who will reach the thresholds of autoregulation. So the whole case, you just say low, you've been safe for it. But if you do drop low, which can sometimes happen after induction, you'll see all of a sudden buckets start to fill. When you start getting down to, let's say, 60, 50 millimeters of mercury, all of a sudden the ARI goes from 0.3 up to 0.8 or 0.9. And then you see, that's an area where we are correlating, which means that we're no longer autoregulating. So if you're lucky, you stay, within a good hemodynamic area, then you're fine. If you do drop down, or if you do have hypertension, you'll see where that upper inflection point is. I would say, or I'd make the argument, the sicker the patient is that you're taking care of, the more likely you will probably pass one of those inflection points and you'll have a complete mapping. And the other beauty of this is, we like to make things simple as physicians, and we think that the autoregulation curve, well, you were born with that and you always keep that, and that doesn't change. I personally think that the autoregulation curve is also something which is very dynamic and will depend on what is your hemoglobin concentration, what is your PCO2, I think plays a very important role. Are you hypoxic, right? So there's a lot of influences, and then perhaps on disease state as well. Is the patient a diabetic? Is it chronic hypertensive? Does the patient have cancer? Or is there other underlying neurological disease processes that might actually change the autoregulation process? So by mapping this in real time, you're actually seeing what the patient has for an autoregulation index now on the table.
Fascinating work.
Yeah, it is. It's great stuff. Well, Greg, we literally could sit here and talk to you all day long about this. I know I say that every conversation because we can. Yeah. It's really great. One final note. So tell us, utilizing it in practice, is there certain patient populations that you guys are, kind of recommending?
It's what I said. I would certainly start off with the higher risk populations. I would be looking more along the lines of where the ASA, 3+ or 4 patients, probably the geriatric population, 70 and above, for the same reason why cerebral oximetry became so popular in cardiac. I think that's the population that you primarily want to target in the beginning, is the high risk, because that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.
All right. Well, Greg, thank you so much for sitting down with us on TopMedTalk. I enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Hopefully, we'll be able to
Sure.
Talk to you again. Maybe next time we're up in New York.
Absolutely.
We'll give you a call. Sound good?
My pleasure. Great.
All right.
Great work.
Thank you, Desiree.
Yes,
All right.
great work. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to TopMedTalk. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already, topmedtalk.com. You'll receive our new
Box sets,
our curated compilation, editor's top picks, so all the great conversations we've had in this last year, as well as the perioperative coach series. And if you subscribe to the newsletter this weekend for another day or so, we'll keep it open, you will win a chance for our Marshall Bluetooth speaker. So if you're on Twitter, you can see that there. It's a real beauty, and it sounds absolutely fabulous. You can listen to TopMedTalk on it. So.
and if you put Everest in the search engine, all the wacky stuff that Mike was talking about.
Yeah.
Extreme
on
Everest,
TopMedTalk,
yeah.
Extreme Everest.
You'll get all that series up.
Yeah, very
right,
good.
great.
All
Brilliant.
right, well, thanks for listening, and we'll be back in just very shortly with Tim Scott. Thanks so much.
TopMedTalk.
It's Desiree Chappell here. Just a quick reminder, subscribe to TopMedTalk. We're a daily source of news and conversation focused on perioperative care. We bring you all the latest talk from all the major conferences in the perioperative space. We can also be found on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and we now have a free mailing list with special offers and additional goodies for subscribers. Go check us out at topmedtalk.com. That's www.topmedtalk.com.